Hello. So did you figure it out? Let's go back to the biodiversity index. What's the value of this index if there's only one species? So what you do, just plug in the numbers. The species are 9 jacarandas out of 9 individuals, so the proportion is 1. And then there's 0 of the other 2. If you put that in the equation, you have 1 times log of 1 plus 0 plus 0. And the log of 1 is 0. So the minimum value of the Shannon-Wiener index is 0. That is the index if there's only one species out of in an ecosystem. So let's compare those two, shall we? Species richness index and the Shannon-Wiener index. So what you see is that with species richness, there's a value of 3 and 3 in the first 2 parks and the value of 1 in the third park. Whereas the Shannon-Wiener index takes into account that evenness and has an index of 1.1, 0.68 and 0 for the third park. So looking at the number of species only, which is what the species richness index does, you're ignoring the dominance of certain species. Whereas the Shannon-Wiener index does account for the evenness. However, you can't use it to compare ecosystems with each other, because they all have different numbers of total species. Let's go and start a new topic. Birds. Why am I focusing on birds? Well, I'm showing you different biodiversity measures and representations of biodiversity using birds as an example. Because there is lots of different species of birds, nearly 10,000, way more bird species than mammal species. They're pretty, so it makes for some pretty photos on the slides. There's no bird species that is found all over the world. And they're very dependent on the habitat that's provided. How do we define what's a bird? Well, they have feathers, which is the most distinguishing feature. Feathers which allows for them to fly, provides insulation and also camouflage. Birds can eat different things: nectar, seeds, insects, meat, leaves. And birds are important for human life. They provide lots of ecosystem services. Do you remember ecosystem services? So they provide provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services and supporting services. What kind of provisioning services would birds provide? Remember, provisioning services were things like food and fiber. Think about it. And maybe ask one of your classmates what they come up with. Other services are regulation of pollination, seed dispersal. They eat fruit and then drop the seeds elsewhere. Pest control. They provide recreational services, cultural services, and supporting services. So, important little species. Let me show you different measures of bird diversity. This first one is a geographical measure, where I show you the number of different bird species across the world. Red is a low number of species, and the darker blue, the higher the different number of species. Australia is pretty blue, South America is very dark blue, but areas in Eastern Europe, Mongolia, Northern Africa are more yellow-orange, which is a relatively low number of bird species. Note that some of the islands, like Madagascar and New Zealand, have relatively few bird species by comparison. So that's representing the number of species on a map. You can also show it differently in a histogram, which is one of the things you talked about with James. So what I've done here is I've mapped the different countries with different bird species, and I just made a histogram of the number of countries with different types of species. Here we created bins that are 200 wide. So that means that we have 0 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 600 number of species. And the frequency is the number of countries that have that number of bird species. So what do you see? What's the number of bird species that most countries in the world have? Yeah, it's between 200 and 400. Does this distribution remind you of distributions that you've seen before? It's not really a normal distribution, because you can see that there's a high density here in the lower regions, and then it gets lower quite quick, and then there's a long tail. There's only a few countries in the world with very high bird diversity. Now you can make these same histograms using other bins. For example, bins of 100 wide, which gives you a little bit more information. So now you can see in more detail that most countries in the world have about 400, between 300 and 400 species, instead of between 200 and 400. In fact, I've also calculated the averages. And you can see that the average is nearly 500 species with a very high standard deviation. Well, that makes sense because you have a very long tail here. And the median is 425. Because the median and the mean are different, that indicates that there is a higher density mass towards the lower end, because the median is lower than the average. And you need to get familiar with these terms: mean, standard deviation, median, and with interpreting these histograms. So that's just the number of species. Another measure that you could look at is the number of threatened bird species. And that picture is a little bit different. So you can see that, for example, so the dark blue is a high number of threatened bird species. You see that the Indo-Pacific, Russia, China, and South America have both a lot of species, which we saw before, but also a lot of threatened species. Australia and the US and New Zealand are also dark blue now, and so is Madagascar, which means that in terms of threatened bird species, they rank quite high. Again, I can plot this in a histogram. So you see the number of threatened bird species on the horizontal axis, and up to 140. And fortunately, most countries, the frequency table here, the number of countries, have between 0 and 10 threatened bird species. But you can see that there is a few that have very high numbers of threatened species. Same thing, but with a different bin setting, gives us a little bit more information you can still see that the distribution is skewed to 0. So it's a good thing. And the difference between the mean and the median tells you the same thing. The mean is 15.6 and the median is lower than that, 9, with a standard deviation of 20. Now let's use that information, the number of threatened bird species and the total number of bird species together to look at the proportion of threatened bird species. Gives you a slightly different picture. Proportion is an important indicator because it tells you how well bird diversity is faring, given how many species there are present in that country. You see that in South America has moved more towards the light blue, yellow, even red numbers. So it's a good thing, they look a little bit better. They don't have the proportion of threatened bird species as the proportion of the total is not that bad. But other countries like New Zealand and Madagascar are now even darker blue. So what does that mean? They have a high proportion of threatened species relative to the total number of species. So let's think about that for a little bit and have a little bit of a break and think about this question. What does it mean if we have a high proportion of threatened bird species? What does that say about either the total number of bird species in a country or about the number of threatened species? Maybe write down, how do we calculate a proportion? And what does it tell us if the proportion of threatened species is high? I'll be back with you in a little bit to give you the answer.